I took the job at the warehouse because it seemed simple enough. Night shifts, minimal work, and plenty of time to kill. The pay wasn't bad either, considering how run down the place was. The locals liked to talk about the warehouse, though. At the diner where I grabbed coffee before my first shift, a group of old men exchanged glances when I mentioned where I'd be working. One of them even muttered something under his breath, but I didn't catch it. The building was a hulking mass of rusted metal and crumbling brick, nestled on the outskirts of a town no one seemed to remember. As I stepped inside, the silence was overwhelming. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty loading bays. It felt like a place where time had stopped, where the world outside had forgotten about it, just like everyone else. I settled into the small security office, the old monitors buzzing with static. My job was straightforward: make my rounds, check the cameras, and report any issues. Easy, right? It started that way. The first few hours passed in almost complete boredom. I paced the aisles, my flashlight sweeping through the darkness, illuminating rows of empty shelves and dust-covered crates. The wind rattled the roof above, but nothing seemed out of place. Then I saw something. Just a flicker, a shift in the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, shining my light, but the beam caught only empty space. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my imagination. After all, old buildings creak and groan. It's part of their charm. Still, that flicker of movement lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. Around midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. I couldn't shake the growing sense of being watched. It was subtle at first, like the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my skin. Then the noises began, soft, almost imperceptible at first. A faint scratching sound echoed from deep within the warehouse. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be the wind. I paused, listening intently, but the sound stopped as soon as I focused on it. An hour later it returned, louder this time, a scratching, like claws dragging across concrete. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but as before, there was nothing. No sign of life, no explanation. I headed back to the security office, my nerves on edge. I needed to check the cameras, see if they'd picked up anything unusual. The grainy images flickered to life, and at first everything seemed normal, just static-filled shots of empty aisles. Then I saw it. In the frame behind me, there was a figure, tall, skeletal, shrouded in darkness. Its eyes burned with an unnatural red glow, piercing through the grainy footage. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was no one there. The room was empty. I turned back to the screen, heart pounding, and the figure had moved. It was closer now, almost looming over where I had been standing moments before. My hand hovered over the radio to call someone, anyone, but I couldn't move. The figure raised a hand, its bony fingers stretching out, beckoning. I felt paralyzed, trapped in some sick nightmare, unable to tear my eyes from the screen. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. I bolted from my chair, knocking over a shelf of boxes as I stumbled backward. The sound echoed through the warehouse, breaking the eerie stillness. I looked again at the monitors. The figure was gone. Panic surged through me. I wasn't going to stay and find out what that thing was. Grabbing my flashlight, I ran faster than I ever thought possible, the empty aisles flashing past me in a blur. The warehouse doors groaned as I pushed them open and burst into the cold night air, my lungs burning from the effort. I didn't stop running until I reached the diner. The fluorescent lights, felt almost welcoming after the oppressive darkness of the warehouse. I slumped into a booth, my hands still shaking. The waitress eyed me with concern as she poured me a cup of coffee, but I couldn't even bring myself to say a word. I wasn't going back. Whatever was in that warehouse, whatever haunted those halls, it could stay there. The next day, I quit. Some say the figure I saw was the ghost of a worker who died in an accident at the warehouse years ago, and maybe that's true. I don't care. I'm done with night shifts, done with warehouses, done with all of it. But the worst part, sometimes in the dead of night, I can still hear it. The faint sound of claws scratching against concrete. And I wonder, for just a moment, if it's still out there, waiting. Starting a new job in the city was supposed to be exciting. Fresh out of school, I landed a position at a marketing firm that everyone in my class envied. The office was sleek, with glossy surfaces and floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the room in light. From my desk, I could see the city stretch out beneath me, a sea of ambition. I thought I had made it. But from the first day, something felt off. It wasn't anything overt, not at first, just little things that gnawed at the back of my mind. Conversations would hush when I walked by, and when I turned to look, my co-workers stared at their screens with unsettling intensity, as if I hadn't been there at all. And then there were the lights. They'd flicker every now and then, but only around me. No one else seemed to notice or care. It escalated in small ways. Files on my desk would be rearranged when I knew I hadn't touched them. Once I came back from lunch and found my chair moved several feet from where I left it. But the strangest thing was the cold. My desk was tucked into a corner, slightly isolated from the others, and no matter how warm the office was, my spot was always freezing. It was a creeping kind of unease, the kind you can't explain away. I kept my head down, tried to focus on the work, but the whispers followed me. Soft at first, just faint murmurs in the background, but they grew louder with each passing day, until one evening, staying late to meet a deadline, I heard my name. Clear as day. I froze, the pen slipping from my hand. I wasn't sure where the voice had come from, but there was no one else in the office. The air around me felt thick, as if I was being watched. My skin prickled, every nerve in my body telling me to get up, to leave. But I stayed. I don't know why. The lights above my desk began to flicker again, more erratic this time. Shadows danced across the walls, and a cold spot settled over my desk, colder than I had ever felt before. I could see my breath in the air. My heart hammered in my chest, but I forced myself to keep working. It was probably nothing, just some faulty wiring. Then the phone rang. I jumped, knocking over a stack of papers. The sharp trill of the phone echoed in the silence of the office. I stared at it, the screen blinking with no caller ID. I didn't want to answer. Every instinct screamed at me not to. But I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the receiver. Static. Just a static, crackling and hissing on the other end. I strained to listen, convinced there had to be something, some voice trying to cut through the noise. For a second I thought I heard breathing, but before I could react, the line went dead. Silence returned, thicker than before. I hung up, my hands shaking. I glanced at the clock, realizing I was alone in the building. Everyone else had gone home. I started packing up my things, desperate to leave. But when I turned back to my computer, the screen had come to life. It flickered, then displayed a single image, a grainy photograph of a woman. Her face was twisted in horror, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. I couldn't look away, transfixed by the terror in her eyes. The image burned itself into my brain, and as I stared, the office around me seemed to close in, the air pressing down, suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, The image vanished. I shot up from my chair, sending it clattering to the floor. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to move. I just needed to get out. As I reached for my bag, I noticed something on the floor, right where my chair had been, a single white rose. Its petals were wilted, the edges already browning, as if it had been left there for days. But I hadn't seen it before. There was no way it had been there earlier. I bolted for the door, not caring if I left things behind. I needed to escape. The image of the woman's face was burned into my mind, haunting me with every step I took. Even as I slammed the door behind me and raced down the stairwell, I felt her presence. Watching, waiting. I never stayed late at the office again. I couldn't. Eventually, I quit. No explanation, no notice. I couldn't be in that place any longer. It still haunts me. The cold, the whispers, the way the shadows seemed to breathe. But the worst was the woman, her face twisted in terror. I've moved on, but the feeling remains. Every so often I catch a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye. Just for a split second, a blur in a window or a shadow in a mirror. And when I do, I hear the whispers again, calling my name. When I first got the job as a cashier, I thought it was just another step towards saving for college. The department store was nothing special. A maze of clothing racks, discount bins, and predictable shoppers. I could handle it. Or so I thought. It started as just a feeling, a prickling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I'd glance up from scanning items, expecting to catch someone staring. But it was always the same, just the steady stream of customers, faces blurred by the routine. Nothing unusual. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Until I saw him. He was at the back of the line, standing half-hidden behind a rack of coats. Something about him immediately felt wrong, like he didn't belong. He was too tall, too thin, with a complexion so pale it was almost sickly. His black coat was buttoned all the way to his chin, and thick sunglasses hid his eyes, despite it being well past dusk outside. No one else seemed to notice him, but I did. My heart skipped, my throat tightened. I forced myself to look away, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every second, I expected him to be right in front of me. When he finally made it to my register, I could barely breathe. He didn't speak. He just placed a small leather-bound notebook on the counter, his bony hand lingering over it for a moment too long. When I reached to scan it, my fingers brushed against his. His skin was ice cold. I flinched, nearly dropping the notebook. That's when he leaned in. His breath was hot and sour, like rotting meat, and he whispered in a voice so low it felt like it crawled under my skin. "You have something that belongs to me." I froze. The words didn't make sense. I don't know what you mean," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. The man smiled, revealing sharp, uneven teeth. "Too many of them. You will return it," he hissed, his voice rasping like dead leaves, "or you will regret it." I didn't have time to react. He took the notebook, paid in exact change, and disappeared into the crowd as quickly as he'd come. 1 minute he was there, and the next, gone. The rest of my shift was a blur. My hands shook as I scanned items, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I wanted to believe it was some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next few days were hell. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile, those two sharp teeth, his breath against my skin. I started looking over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see him standing just behind me, watching. But he wasn't there. At least, not yet. Then came the night I was walking home. The street was nearly empty, the only sound the faint hum of the streetlights overhead. But I felt it again, that prickling, like eyes boring into the back of my head. I turned, my heart pounding. No one. Just shadows stretching across the pavement. I kept walking, faster now, my footsteps quickening in rhythm with my breath. My mind screamed that I wasn't alone. Every corner I turned, every alley I passed, I expected him to be waiting. And then, under the glow of a flickering streetlight, I saw him. The man from the store stood motionless, his long coat hanging off his skeletal frame. His sunglasses still covered his eyes, but I felt them. They were on me. Watching, measuring. I froze. My legs refused to move. The street seemed to close in around me, the world shrinking until it was just me and him, trapped in a silent game. He took a step forward, then another. His movements slow, deliberate, like a predator closing in on wounded prey. "Stay back," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't stop. Every muscle in my body had screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by sheer terror. He was just a few feet away now, close enough that I could hear the faint rustle of his coat as it brushed against the ground. Then, just as he was about to reach me, he vanished. One blink, and he was gone. I gasped, stumbling backward, my pulse roaring in my ears. The street was empty. There was no trace of him, no footsteps, no lingering shadow, nothing. I ran. I didn't care where I was going, just that I needed to get away. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My chest heaved, my thoughts scrambled. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? But the next morning, when I opened my door, there it was, the leather-bound notebook, sitting on my doorstep, waiting. I don't know what to do. Every instinct tells me to get rid of it, but I can't. Somehow I know that throwing it away won't help. He'll come back. He always does. And next time, I don't think he'll let me go.